Yes, so our last talk is going to be by Jacob Brenner. Okay, and he is a clinical instructor, pulmonary and critical care division. Jake.
Well, hello. While that starts to load up, I'll just introduce myself. So I'm Jake Brenner. I'm a pulmonary critical care physician at Penn. I spend about 20% of my time seeing patients and the other 80% developing technologies just like this. And I think there it is. Okay, great. And so what I'll be telling you about today is not the majority of what I work on, which is nanotechnology, but actually a medical device that can much more rapidly than my nanoscale technologies make it to patients. And that's one of the reasons I think Penn Health Tech is a perfect environment to enable technologies like this that have a much quicker time horizon that we can start seeing benefit to our patients. And so the problem I'm going to be telling you about today is trying to help people with COPD breathe easier again. And so COPD is popularly called emphysema, and you may have seen commercials for it on TV because it's the third leading cause of morbidity and mortality in the United States. And basically, emphysema is a disease where smoking changes the lungs over time such that patients cannot breathe during physical activity. And so they're generally fine when they're sitting still, but as soon as they go to move, the most severe patients feel like they're suffocating. And so there are 15 million diagnosed patients in the US, but we're focusing more on the patients who have developed a severe version of this that eventually become confined to their house, then eventually chairs, and eventually their bed. And unfortunately, they live like this for a long time where whenever they move, they feel like they're suffocating. And that's generally a sensation that they report, suffocation. This isn't just like getting winded when you've gone for a jog. And so how many of patients have such a severe disease? Well, 2 million in the US have such severe COPD they can't even climb a flight of stairs on maximal medical therapy. And so that maximal medical therapy includes whatever inhalers we give them. So inhalers, unfortunately, they're big business, but they don't actually improve patient outcomes and shortness of breath very much. And then also occasionally, well, about a third of the patients will have nasal cannula oxygen, which helps outcomes, but it doesn't make patients feel any better. So on this maximal medical therapy, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry, these patients still can't climb a flight of stairs without feeling like they're suffocating, and many of them can't even get out of a chair. And so that's the target patient population that we want to help. And so because we were asked to show markets and see that Penn Health Tech is a little different than our average basic science, we want to talk about what is the market that could support the development of such a technology, because we can't entirely do this in academia. So this is about 2 million COPD patients, severe COPD patients, and that's actually a conservative estimate. It may be as high as 2.8 million. And the device will show you it has a predicate technology, so it already has a business model that already exists for another disease state and can be rented by the insurance company. And we figure that we can charge roughly the same amount that all the inhalers go for. Multiple different classes end up in roughly the same price range of $3,500 a year, which would put us in a bottom-up estimated market of about $7 billion. So certainly a good enough market to warrant the type of investment that often comes from venture capital and other sources for med tech. And so we're not here to displace the standard of care. So that's supplemental oxygen for some patients and inhalers for the rest. But that standard of care is grossly insufficient because, as I said, we define our patient population as those who still feel like they're suffocating whenever they move, even on maximal medical therapy. So we're going to be add-on therapy and therefore have less displacement resistance that's going to come from the entrenched industry of inhalers. And so what is the technology? So first, it's important to think about how we breathe. So when all of us are breathing right now, our diaphragm goes down and our chest wall expands when we take a breath in. But in COPD, the smoking has changed the lung structure over time such that patients have an increased work of breathing. And when I say work of breathing, I mean in the physics sense of the word work. So that for every breath, they have to expend more energy than us. And when they start moving, that's when the energy expenditure really goes up, such that most of their energy expenditure whenever they're moving is actually going to their breathing muscles. And so what happens is their respiratory muscles tire out quickly. And it's the moment at which they tire out that they feel like they're suffocating. It actually has nothing to do with oxygenation in these patients. we can fix their oxygenation. It's the muscles tiring out is when they feel short of breath. So we said, okay, that seems like a problem that is potentially solvable by a widget, which is what we make. So we said, let's take off that worker breathing. And so our device is basically a shell that goes over the anterior chest and abdomen. With each breath in, it creates a vacuum that lifts the chest and abdomen, and that enables the patient to draw air in. With each breath out, it increases the pressure, so helping the patient exhale the air, which is actually a big problem in COPD, perhaps their biggest. And all of that is integrated into this, with this vest here that you can see on the right. And so you might say, well, how do we know this thing on the right is going to work? Where did this idea come from? Is it totally blue sky? Well, no, not entirely. It really came from a chain of innovations that lasted a long time. So the first is actually an invention that came from Philadelphia. It's Brian, in his initial history of Philadelphia innovations, didn't mention one the pulmonologists love to mention, which is the Drinker lung, which was one of the first iron lungs, and from Philip Drinker, who runs our society our society is named after in Philadelphia. And so the iron lung existed and was displaced in the 1960s when positive pressure ventilation came about for outpatients who could have a hole stuck in their neck, cut in their neck to breathe in positive pressure ventilation, or a tube down their throat. So that essentially eliminated iron lung ventilation, except for there was this one corner of medicine that still uses it, and only a relatively rare fraction of pulmonologists end up using it, which is called a cuirass ventilator. And it's basically a shell that goes over the anterior chest and abdomen, just like ours. And it's used for patients who are paralyzed but don't want to get a tracheostomy. So these are patients typically with Lou Gehrig's disease. And it can do the entire work of breathing for them. And this is, at the bottom, an example of the modern cuirass ventilator. So this device has been around for 30 years. It's used on only about 1,000 patients a year in the US because there aren't that many paralyzed patients who need this kind of thing. But what it did is it proved a predicate idea for us. And this device, unfortunately, is not at all useful for COPD patients because they're fine when they're sitting around. This device weighs 40 pounds and is completely immobile. So what we said is, well, why don't we just tailor that for COPD? Why don't we shrink that down and tailor it to the physiology of COPD, because their breathing problems are quite a bit different than the patients with neuromuscular disease. So that's exactly what we did. And so this is our shell, this is our device, we call it the AirAd device, and you can see that it has a shell that goes over the anterior chest and abdomen and does essentially the same thing as that predicate device I showed you, but instead of being 40 pounds and completely immobile, ours is eventually going to be, well, fairly soon, 2.5 pounds, and right now it's about 6 to 7 pounds. And all that weight is put on the hips, which is very important for COPD patients because they need to use their upper chest muscles more than any of us do, so they can't have any weight on their shoulders. So important points of IP and testing that we've come to learn. And what we've already shown is that we can generate, with this very, very small device, we can generate pressure traces. So here on the top, on the right side, you have a pressure trace of a plethysmograph trace, so we can measure breathing very specifically with a band that goes around the chest, a somewhat novel method of measuring breathing. And we can then produce shell pressures within that chamber that are equivalent or even exceed that of the predicate device that's used for paralyzed patients. So we've already shown that this works. We've done this on healthy volunteers. We've shown that we can even improve their exercise tolerance when we simulate COPD by making them breathe essentially through a very narrow straw. And now we're moving into the next phase where we want to start testing in our severe COPD patients. So you might say, well, in my nanotechnology research, for instance, I'm always aiming for something that's very novel because that's what works in academia. But in getting devices to patients, we often have to think, well, what is the chain of predicates that's going to prove your regulatory path and your reimbursement path? And that's why we chose this particular innovation that was not such a huge departure. And really all we did is we took cuirass ventilation that's been around since the 1970s and tailored it for COPD. And it became a totally new engineering problem by focusing on a different disease state, because paralyzed patients need full support for 24/7, but COPD patients, our patients that we've talked to, they only want to be supported for an hour a day so they can, for instance, cook themselves a meal or get out of the house to go down the block. So we have a very different problem, and that enabled us to be light and mobile. And it also enabled us to build a nice patent fence. So we've already have our utility patents filed and focusing on the cuirass built into a garment and mechanical changes that were necessary. And importantly, because this is an old technology, it enabled us to have a relatively easy proof that we have freedom to operate, which is very important for a startup trying to get funding in this space. And so the timeline, so we built our first device only in about March of this year and began our healthy volunteer testing a few months ago and right before the last Penn Health Tech Symposium. And since then, we've been improving it. And importantly, we have an ability to have a relatively rapid design test loop for a device that could really impact someone's life. Usually, you have a surgical device that's going to take a long time between when you change the device and when you can test it in a patient again. The FDA has very strict requirements on that, but we have FDA's non-significant risk status. So NSR status confers the ability to make as many changes as we want and not needing to go back to the FDA each time we test it on a patient. So we can literally now test it on right now healthy volunteers, but soon to be patients, and later that day test an improved version on them. And so once we start our study in COPD patients at Penn, which is going to be run by the former chief of pulmonary at Penn, the trial, we'll be able to quickly iterate through this. And so we're starting our severe COPD patients at the very beginning of 2018. And we actually hope for FDA approval, 510K approval in that should say Q3 2019. And so we already talked about that design test loop. And what I wanted to mention is Penn ecosystem really was an critical portion of AIRAD's development. So first, we have on-site clinical testing. So the fact that I'm a clinician in pulmonary has enabled us to get a lot of resources within the pulmonary division to test this in our pulmonary function testing lab. We do a lot of measurements of various physiological parameters. We also have a lot of specialized manufacturing and testing facilities here that enabled us, for instance, to build things like that shell and do it in a customized fashion. And then we also have had close collaboration with many different experts here that I can talk to you about later. And so with this design test loop, we are getting to the stage where we're about to start our first severe COPD patients. And so what are the things that we've been working on? So we've developed specialized anatomical supports for COPD patients, which enable us to even have a version of the device that would be for less severe COPD patients and not even require any energy actuation. Just keeping their shoulders lifted up on their hips turns out to be very beneficial. We've also done a lot of work on trying to custom fit our shell to the patient's body in a cheap way that can be done very rapidly in the clinic. And to do that, the eventual plan is we make a 3D model of the patient using a phone. We actually have an app provider that can create, you use the physician's phone, have a patient spin around, you get a perfect 3D rendering of their body, and then we have very simple process to get our shell customized once we have their measurements. And other things that we've been doing are to get that plethysmograph to work, that meaning that breathing trace, we've had to put in a smart fabric breathing sensor. So we basically have a fabric that changes conductance when the patient breathes, and that's how we measure breathing so well. And now we've been working with ultra lightweight pneumatic systems and gotten down our size dramatically. And so this does take a team, and that's very important, and being at Penn in Philadelphia has really enabled that to happen. So I myself, I'm a pulmonologist, and like I mentioned at the very beginning, I spend 20% of my time seeing patients in the ICU, the other 80% doing research. But a lot of that research is molecular, because I have to get NIH grants and other things to maintain a lab presence. And so to enable a project like this for a clinician scientist really required the environment of Penn Health Tech, which provides expertise, connections, all the things that busy clinicians often don't have time to do. I'm joined in this endeavor by Michael and Merrick Svoboda, who are both engineers with tremendous experience who really built all this and have done an amazing job at that. And then also this project, the clinical study is being co-run by Perry Dubin, who was a resident here and now is a finished residency and is able to run this trial. And again, the kind of thing I was only able to meet through a Penn Health Tech connection is how I met Perry Dubin. So all this came together and will continue because of what Penn Health Tech has provided. And so our hope is that with Penn Health Tech support, we'll be able to create a device that will enable our COPD patients to get out of their chair and bed and actually live their life. Thanks.